The dust hung thick in the air of Fort Stanton, New Mexico. The day Aurora Catherine watched her mother count out coins with trembling hands, knowing those coins came from selling her only daughter like livestock. It was April 1878, and the drought had turned the land into cracked earth and desperation, reducing their small farming community to hollow-eyed shadows of the people they once were. Aurora was 19 years old, with dark auburn hair that caught the sunlight like copper wire and eyes the color of sage after rain. And she had just been traded to a traveling merchant named Silas Drummond for 3 sacks of cornmeal and 2 sides of salted pork. Her mother, Margaret, could not meet her gaze as the transaction took place in their bare kitchen, where the paint peeled from the walls like old skin and the cupboards gaped empty. Aurora's father had died 2 winters before from pneumonia, leaving them with debts they could never hope to repay and land, too parched to yield anything but dust devils and broken dreams. Her younger brother, Thomas, only 12, stood in the doorway with tears streaming down his dirt-smudged face, and Aurora forced herself to smile at him even as her heart shattered into pieces small enough to blow away on the hot wind that never stopped howling through the valley. Drummond was a heavy-set man with greasy hair and fingers stained yellow from tobacco, and he looked at Aurora the way a man might examine a horse he was considering buying, checking her teeth and the straightness of her spine. She wanted to spit in his face, wanted to run, but where would she go with no money, no supplies, and a family that would starve without the food her sale had purchased? So she gathered her few belongings into a canvas sack, kissed Thomas on the forehead, and walked past her mother without a word, because there were no words left between them that would not taste like poison. The wagon Drummond drove was loaded with goods he planned to sell at the mining camps up north, near Santa Fe, and Aurora sat in the back among crates of whiskey bottles and farm tools, watching Fort Stanton shrink behind them until it was just a brown smudge against the endless blue sky. Drummond said little to her during the journey, which suited her fine, though she could feel his eyes on her sometimes when he thought she was not paying attention. They traveled for 3 days through country that grew gradually less barren, following old Spanish trails that wound through juniper-dotted hills and past rock formations that looked like the bones of ancient giants. On the 4th day, they encountered a group of men on horseback blocking the road. Aurora's first thought was bandits, and her hand instinctively went to the small knife she kept hidden in her boot, the only protection she had. But as the riders drew closer, she saw they wore the weathered clothes of working cowboys, and the man at the front sat his horse with the easy confidence of someone born to the saddle. He was tall even sitting down, with broad shoulders and sun-darkened skin that spoke of years spent outdoors. His hair was black as a raven's wing beneath his dusty hat, and when he looked at Aurora, his eyes were the startling gray-green of a stormy sky, fierce and intelligent, and somehow kind all at once. He appeared to be in his middle 20s, with the lean hardness of a man who knew what it meant to work for everything he had. "Where are you headed?" the cowboy asked Drummond, his voice deep and even, with a slight drawl that marked him as someone who had spent time in Texas. "Santa Fe," Drummond replied curtly. "Got business there." "What's it to you?" The cowboy's gaze shifted to Aurora and something flickered in his expression. Recognition, maybe, or concern. "That your daughter, my property," Drummond said, and Aurora felt sick at the word. "Bought and paid for." The cowboys exchanged glances, and the tension in the air grew thick as summer honey. The leader urged his horse forward a few steps, and Aurora could see now that he wore a Colt revolver on his hip, the grip worn smooth from use. "That right, miss?" he asked her directly. "You his property?" Aurora lifted her chin, refusing to show the fear churning in her stomach. "My mother sold me for food," she said clearly, "to keep my brother from starving. So I suppose in the eyes of the law, Mr. Drummond here owns me like he owns those whiskey crates." Something dangerous flashed in the cowboy's storm-colored eyes. "What's your name?" "Aurora Catherine." "Well, Miss Catherine, my name is Zachary Aldrich, and I run a cattle ranch about 10 miles west of here. Been looking for someone to help with the cooking and housekeeping, seeing as how my last cook ran off to prospect for gold and left me with nothing but my own terrible coffee." He looked back at Drummond. "How much you pay for her?" Drummond's face reddened. "That's none of your concern. Now move aside before there's trouble." Zachary's hand drifted casually toward his revolver. "I asked you a question." The other cowboys spread out slightly, and Aurora realized they were surrounding the wagon. Drummond seemed to realize it too, because some of the bluster left his voice. "3 sacks of cornmeal and 2 sides of pork," he muttered. Zachary reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a leather wallet. "I will give you $50 in gold coin for Miss Catherine's papers of sale, plus another 10 for your trouble in coming this far." "She's worth more than that," Drummond protested, but without much conviction. "She's worth more than all the gold in California," Zachary said flatly. "But $60 is what I am offering. Take it or leave it, but either way, Miss Catherine is coming with me." Aurora's heart hammered against her ribs. She did not know this Zachary Aldrich from Adam, had no idea if he was any better than Drummond, but something in his direct gaze and the protective way his cowboys had positioned themselves made her think he might be a decent man. Or at least, a man who did not like seeing women traded like cattle. Drummond snatched the money from Zachary's hand and scrawled out a hasty bill of sale on a piece of paper he pulled from his coat. "She's your problem now," he spat, then snapped the reins and drove the wagon forward through the gauntlet of horsemen. Aurora stood in the dust, clutching her canvas sack, as Zachary dismounted in one fluid motion. Up close, he was even taller than she had thought, at least 6 feet, with the kind of presence that seemed to fill up all the space around him. But his voice when he spoke was gentle. "Miss Catherine, I meant what I said about needing help at the ranch, but I want you to know that you're free. I did not buy you to own you. I bought you to set you free from that man." He held out the bill of sale, then struck a match and set it ablaze, letting it burn to ash at their feet. "You can work for me if you want, and I will pay you fair wages, or I can take you back to Fort Stanton, or anywhere else you want to go." Aurora watched the paper burn, watched her slavery turn to smoke and blow away on the wind. She thought about going back to Fort Stanton, to her mother who had traded her for food, to Thomas whom she loved but could not save. She thought about the empty cupboards and the dead crops, and the way her mother's hands had shaken when she took Drummond's payment. What would the wages be? She asked. $20 a month plus room and board, Zachary said. "The work's honest, cooking and cleaning mainly, some mending. The ranch hands are good men. They will treat you with respect or answer to me." $20 a month was more money than Aurora had ever had in her life. In a few months, she could save enough to send some back to Thomas, to make sure he had food and maybe even a chance at something better. "I will take the work," she said. Zachary's face broke into a smile that transformed him from stern to handsome. "Good. You can ride with me. Do you know how?" "I grew up on a farm," Aurora said. "I can ride." He helped her up onto his horse, a big bay gelding with kind eyes, then swung up behind her. Aurora tensed at the closeness, at the feeling of his solid warmth at her back. But Zachary kept his hands carefully positioned on either side of her, not touching except where necessary to hold the reins. They rode west with the other cowboys, men who introduced themselves as Cal, James, and Rodriguez, all of them friendly in a rough-edged way that spoke of hard work and harder living. The ranch, when they reached it, was more impressive than Aurora had expected. A sprawling adobe house with a red-tiled roof sat at the center of several outbuildings, corrals full of horses and cattle, and a windmill that creaked as it turned in the constant breeze. The land here was greener than around Fort Stanton, with actual grass for the livestock and cottonwood trees growing along a creek that sparkled in the afternoon sun. "We have a good water source," Zachary explained as he helped her down from the horse. "That's what makes the difference out here. Water is everything." He showed her to a small but clean room at the back of the house, with a real bed and a window that looked out toward the mountains. There was a wash basin with fresh water, and someone had even put wildflowers in a jar on the dresser. Aurora set down her canvas sack and turned to find Zachary watching her from the doorway. "Thank you," she said, and meant it with her whole heart. "You're welcome here, Aurora," he said, using her first name for the first time, "for as long as you want to stay." Over the following weeks, Aurora settled into a routine at the ranch. She woke before dawn to start coffee and breakfast for the hands, who ate like they were starving and praised her cooking like she was a French chef, even though she only knew how to make simple things like biscuits and bacon and beans. She swept and scrubbed and mended clothes, and in the afternoons, when the heat grew too fierce for heavy work, she would sit in the shade of the cottonwoods and watch Zachary work with the horses. He was a natural horseman, patient and firm, able to gentle even the wildest Mustang with nothing but time and trust. She found herself watching him more than she should, noticing the way his muscles moved beneath his shirt when he lifted heavy saddles, the way he laughed at his men's jokes, the way he always seemed to know when she was looking and would glance up to meet her eyes. They talked in the evenings, after supper when the men had gone to the bunkhouse, and it was just the two of them in the big kitchen with the lamp burning low. Zachary told her about growing up in Texas, the son of a rancher who had lost everything in the war. He had come to New Mexico territory 7 years ago with nothing but a good horse and big dreams, and had built this ranch from scratch through sweat and determination, and a knack for knowing cattle. Aurora told him about Fort Stanton, about her father's death and the drought that followed, about Thomas, and how much she missed him. She did not talk much about her mother, because that wound was still too raw, still bled when she prodded it. Zachary seemed to understand, never pushed for more than she was willing to give. One evening in early June, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold, Zachary said, "I have been thinking about Fort Stanton." Aurora's chest tightened. "What about it?" "About the drought, about how many people must be suffering like your family was." He turned to look at her, his gray-green eyes serious. "I have had a good year. The cattle are healthy, prices are up, and I just sold a big herd to the army for a fair profit. I could spare some supplies, maybe load up a wagon with food and necessities, take it down there." "That's very generous," Aurora said carefully, not sure where he was going with this. "I was thinking you might want to come with me," Zachary continued. "See your brother, make sure he's all right. Maybe talk to your mother if you want to." Aurora's first instinct was to refuse, to say she never wanted to see her mother again. But the thought of Thomas, of knowing whether he was still alive, whether he had enough to eat, pulled at her like a hook in her heart. "I do not know if I can face her," she admitted quietly. Zachary reached over and took her hand, the first time he had touched her on purpose since that day he helped her onto his horse. His palm was calloused from years of hard work, warm and solid and real. "You do not have to face her alone," he said. "I will be right there with you." Something shifted inside Aurora's chest, like a door opening onto a room full of light. She looked at their joined hands, then up at Zachary's face, and saw something there that made her breath catch. Not pity, not obligation, but something warmer, something that had been growing between them through all those evenings of talking and all those stolen glances across the kitchen. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "Why did you buy me from Drummond? Why give me a job? Why offer to help my family?" Zachary was quiet for a long moment, his thumb moving in slow circles on the back of her hand. "At first, because it was the right thing to do," he said finally. "But now, Aurora, it is because I have come to care for you. More than I probably should, given that you work for me and have only been here a month. But I cannot help it. You're strong and brave and beautiful, and when I look at you, I see the kind of woman I could spend my whole life getting to know." Aurora's heart was beating so hard she was sure he could hear it. "I care for you too," she whispered. "I have been trying not to because I was afraid that if I let myself feel something good, it would just get taken away like everything else. But Zachary, when I am with you, I feel safe. I feel like maybe I could be happy again." He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, and the tenderness of the gesture made tears prick at Aurora's eyes. "I want to court you properly," he said, "if you will let me. I know you have been through something terrible, and I do not want to rush you or make you feel obligated because I helped you. But I would like the chance to show you that not all men are like Drummond, that some of us know how to cherish a woman the way she deserves." "Yes," Aurora said, smiling through her tears. "Yes, I would like that very much." He kissed her then, soft and sweet, his hand cupping her cheek like she was something precious. Aurora leaned into him, letting herself feel the warmth and safety of his embrace, letting herself hope that maybe, just maybe, something good could come from all this suffering. They spent the next week preparing for the trip to Fort Stanton. Zachary loaded a wagon with sacks of cornmeal, flour, beans, and dried beef, along with vegetable seeds for planting, medical supplies, and bolts of fabric. He seemed determined to bring enough to make a real difference, and Aurora felt a rush of affection watching him work, watching him care about people he had never met simply because they were hungry. They set out on a bright morning with Cal and Rodriguez accompanying them as guards, because the roads could be dangerous, and Zachary was not taking any chances with Aurora's safety. The journey south took 4 days, retracing the route Aurora had traveled with Drummond, but going in the opposite direction, toward her past instead of away from it. As they drew closer to Fort Stanton, Aurora's anxiety grew. She had not seen Thomas in 2 months, had not heard any news about whether he was alive or dead, healthy or sick. And her mother, the woman who had given birth to her and raised her and then sold her like a sack of grain. Aurora did not know what she would say to her, what she even felt any more beyond a dull ache where love used to be. The town looked worse than when she had left. The drought had not broken, and more buildings stood empty now, their windows dark and hollow. People moved slowly through the dusty streets, thin and worn, and children with distended bellies sat in the shade looking listless. Aurora directed Zachary to her mother's house, her old house, and was shocked to see how ramshackle it looked, the roof sagging and one of the porch posts broken. She climbed down from the wagon on shaking legs, and Zachary was immediately at her side, his hand on the small of her back, steadying her. Before they could knock, the door flew open and Thomas burst out, taller than Aurora remembered but painfully thin, his eyes huge in his gaunt face. "Aurora!" He cried and threw himself into her arms. She held him tight, tears streaming down her face, feeling his ribs through his threadbare shirt. "I am here," she whispered. "I am here, Thomas." Her mother appeared in the doorway, and Aurora was shocked at how much she had aged in just 2 months. Margaret Catherine's hair had gone almost entirely gray, and she moved like an old woman, bent and slow. When she saw Aurora, she stopped, her hand going to her mouth. "Aurora," she breathed, "you came back." "Not for you," Aurora said, her voice colder than she intended. "For Thomas." Margaret flinched as if struck, but nodded. "I understand." Zachary stepped forward, removing his hat. "Madam, my name is Zachary Aldrich. I run a cattle ranch near here, and I have brought some supplies for the town. Aurora tells me things have been difficult." "Difficult?" Margaret repeated, laughing bitterly. "That's one word for it. We are starving, Mr. Aldrich. Half the town has already left, gone to try their luck elsewhere. Those of us who remain are just waiting to see if the rains come before we all die." "Mama," Thomas said sharply, his arm still around Aurora's waist. Aurora looked around at the dying town, at the people beginning to emerge from their houses to stare at the loaded wagon, hope dawning on their hollow faces. She thought about how her mother had sold her to feed Thomas, about the impossible choice between death and degradation, about how desperation could make monsters of even good people. "We brought food," she said quietly. "Enough for everyone if it is rationed carefully. And seeds for planting, in case the rains do come." Zachary and his men began unloading the wagon in the town square, and word spread quickly. People came from all directions, and Aurora saw faces she had known her whole life, neighbors and friends who had danced at barn raisings and gathered for church socials, all of them reduced to this desperate scrambling for survival. Zachary organized the distribution with the calm efficiency of a man used to managing large operations, making sure everyone got a fair share, that the elderly and the children were taken care of first. Aurora worked beside him, measuring out portions and recording names in a ledger so they would know if anyone was missed. It took hours, but by the time the sun began to set, every family in Fort Stanton had food enough for several weeks and seeds to plant for the future. The gratitude in people's eyes was overwhelming, and more than one person thanked Aurora with tears streaming down their faces. When the crowd finally dispersed, Aurora found herself standing with Zachary, Thomas, and her mother in the empty square. The silence was heavy, weighted with all the things that needed to be said. "Why did you do this?" Margaret asked, looking at the empty wagon. "After what I did to you, why would you come back and help us?" Aurora took a deep breath, searching for the right words. "Because Thomas is still here," she said finally. "And because I know what hunger feels like, what desperation does to people. I do not forgive you, Mama. I do not know if I ever will, but I do not want you to die either." Margaret's face crumpled and she covered it with her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs. Thomas looked between them, his young face etched with pain and confusion. Zachary spoke then, his voice gentle but firm. "Miss Catherine, if you are willing, I have a proposition. My ranch needs workers, people who are not afraid of hard work and long hours. The pay is fair, and there is food enough for everyone. If you and Thomas want to come work for me, you would be welcome. The drought has not been as bad where I am, and there are opportunities there that do not exist here anymore." Margaret looked up, hope and disbelief warring in her expression. "You would do that, after everything?" "I am doing it for Aurora," Zachary said honestly. "Because she still loves her brother, and maybe deep down, she still loves you too, even if she cannot admit it yet. And I am doing it because no one should have to watch their family starve." Aurora felt fresh tears burning in her eyes. She looked at Thomas, at his too thin frame and hopeful expression, and knew what her answer had to be. "Come with us," she said. "Both of you, start over somewhere new." Thomas whooped with joy and hugged her again, and even Margaret managed a trembling smile. They spent that night in the old house. Aurora sleeping in her childhood bed for the last time while Zachary and his men camped outside. In the morning, they loaded what few possessions the Catherine family had left into the wagon and began the journey back to the ranch. It was strange, traveling with her mother after everything that had happened. They did not talk much, but Aurora noticed how Margaret watched her with Zachary, saw the way his hand would find the small of Aurora's back when he helped her down from the wagon, the way they would talk quietly together in the evenings. Margaret said nothing, but Aurora could see the questions in her eyes, the wonder that her daughter had somehow landed in such a good situation. When they arrived at the ranch, Zachary put Margaret and Thomas to work alongside the other hands. Margaret, despite her age and frailty, proved to be an excellent seamstress and took over all the mending and repairs. Thomas followed the cowboys around like a devoted puppy, learning to rope and ride, filling out quickly on regular meals and growing stronger every day. Aurora watched her brother thrive, saw him laugh and joke with the ranch hands, saw him look at Zachary with something like worship. It eased some of the ache in her heart, knowing that Thomas at least was going to be all right. As for her mother, that was more complicated. Margaret worked hard, never complained, and kept mostly to herself. But sometimes Aurora would catch her staring with an expression of such profound regret that it was almost painful to witness. They existed in a state of careful politeness. Not enemies, but not family either. Just two women trying to survive in proximity to each other. Summer deepened into autumn, and the relationship between Aurora and Zachary blossomed into something real and beautiful. He courted her with a patience and respect that still managed to make her heart race. Bringing her wildflowers he picked himself, teaching her to ride better so they could explore the ranch together, stealing kisses in the barn when he thought no one was looking. In September, on a cool evening when the cottonwoods had turned gold and the air smelled of coming rain, Zachary took Aurora back to the spot where they had first really talked, out by the creek where the water sang over smooth stones. "Aurora Catherine," he said, taking both her hands in his. "These past 5 months have been the happiest of my life. You are everything I ever wanted in a partner, strong and smart and kind, beautiful inside and out. I know we have not known each other long by some standards, but out here, 5 months is enough time to know your own heart." He dropped to one knee and Aurora's breath caught in her throat. "I love you," Zachary said simply. "I loved you from the moment I saw you in that wagon, looking fierce and scared and defiant all at once. I have loved you more every day since. Will you marry me? Will you be my wife and my partner and the person I get to wake up next to for the rest of my life?" Aurora pulled him to his feet and kissed him hard, pouring all her love and joy and gratitude into it. "Yes," she said when they finally broke apart. "Yes, Zachary Aldrich, I will marry you. I love you so much it terrifies me sometimes, but it also makes me feel brave, like I could do anything as long as you are beside me." They were married in November, a simple ceremony in the ranch house with the hands and Thomas and even Margaret in attendance. Aurora wore a dress Margaret had sewn for her, pale blue cotton with lace at the collar, and Zachary wore his best suit, looking so handsome he took her breath away. When the traveling preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Zachary kissed her like she was the most precious thing in the world, and Aurora felt happiness bubble up inside her like a spring after drought. The celebration afterward was rowdy and joyful, with music and dancing and more food than anyone could eat. Aurora danced with her new husband, with Thomas, who was nearly as tall as her now, and finally, reluctantly, with her mother. "You look beautiful," Margaret said softly as they moved in a slow circle. "So happy. He is a good man." "He is the best man I have ever known," Aurora replied, Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "I am so sorry," she whispered, "for what I did to you. For being too weak, too frightened to find another way. I will never forgive myself, Aurora, but I hope that someday you might be able to." Aurora looked at her mother, really looked at her, and saw the weight of guilt and regret that she carried, saw how it had aged her and worn her down. She thought about all that had happened, about how selling her had actually led to this happiness, to Zachary and the ranch, and a life she never could have imagined back in Fort Stanton. It did not excuse what her mother had done, but it did complicate it, made it less black and white than she wanted it to be. "I am working on it," Aurora said finally. "That is all I can promise right now. I am working on it." Margaret nodded, tears spilling down her lined face, and Aurora felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen, just a little. That night, in the big bedroom that was now theirs, Zachary made love to Aurora with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. Afterward, they lay tangled together, her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I have been thinking," Zachary said, running his fingers through her loose hair, "about Fort Stanton and all those other towns that are suffering from the drought." Aurora tilted her head to look at him. "What about them? We should do more," he said. "This ranch is profitable enough that we could afford to send regular supplies, maybe even help people relocate if they want to. And I was thinking, once we build up a bit more capital, we could sink some wells, help other communities improve their water access. Water is life out here, Aurora. If we can help people get reliable water, they can survive anything." Aurora felt her love for this man deepen even further. "You want to save the whole territory," she said wonderingly. "I want to make a difference," he corrected. "I have been lucky, had good land and good water and good timing. It seems wrong to just keep it all to ourselves when there are people dying of thirst and hunger within a day's ride." "Then we will do it together," Aurora said firmly. "You and me, we will find a way to help." Over the next year, they made good on that promise. Zachary organized supply runs to struggling communities, hired men to dig wells and install windmills, helped families relocate to areas with better prospects. Aurora became the heart of these relief efforts, her own experience with desperation making her uniquely suited to understand what people needed most. In December of 1879, she gave birth to their first child, a son they named Thomas Zachary Aldrich, in honor of her brother and his father. Aurora had been terrified during the pregnancy, frightened by the stories she had heard of women dying in childbirth. But Zachary had been there through every moment, holding her hand and telling her she was strong enough to do this. When she held her tiny son for the first time, with Zachary sitting beside her on the bed looking awestruck and terrified in equal measure, Aurora felt a completeness she had never known was possible. This was her family, her real family, built not on blood alone but on love and choice and commitment. Thomas the younger, her brother, was absolutely smitten with his nephew and namesake, and could often be found rocking the baby while Margaret sang old lullabies she had once sung to Aurora. Watching her mother with her grandson, Aurora felt more of that tightness in her chest release. Margaret had made a terrible choice out of desperation, had hurt Aurora deeply, but she was also trying so hard to make amends, to be a good grandmother and a helpful presence in their lives. One spring evening, when little Thomas was 6 months old and the ranch was thriving, Aurora found her mother sitting alone on the porch, watching the sunset. "Mama," she said, sitting down beside her. "Can we talk?" Margaret looked at her with surprise and wariness. "Of course." Aurora took a deep breath. "I have been thinking a lot about forgiveness, about what it means and whether I am capable of it, and I realized something. I cannot change what happened. I cannot go back and undo the fact that you sold me." But I also cannot spend the rest of my life angry, because that anger is like drinking poison and expecting you to die. Margaret's hands twisted in her lap, her face pale. I do not think I will ever be able to forget what you did, Aurora continued. And our relationship will never be what it was before. But I am willing to try to build something new, something different. Not a mother and daughter exactly, but family still. Because Thomas needs his grandmother, and my son needs to know his family, and I need to not carry this weight anymore. Aurora, Margaret breathed, tears streaming down her face. Thank you. Thank you for giving me a second chance. They held each other and cried, and Aurora felt the last of the poison drain away, leaving her lighter and freer than she had been in years. It was not a fairy tale reconciliation, not perfect or complete, but it was real and it was enough. The years that followed were good ones. Aurora and Zachary had 2 more children, a daughter they named Sarah in 1881 and another son called Jacob in 1884. The ranch continued to prosper, and their relief efforts expanded to cover most of southern New Mexico territory. They became known throughout the region as people you could turn to in times of trouble, people who understood what it meant to struggle and who would help without judgment. Thomas, Aurora's brother, grew into a fine young man, eventually becoming Zachary's partner in running the ranch. He married a girl from Santa Fe in 1885, and they built a house on the property, staying close to the family that had saved him. Margaret lived to see all her grandchildren grow, and though she never fully shed the weight of what she had done, she found a kind of peace in her final years, knowing that somehow, miraculously, everything had turned out all right. In 1888, on a warm June evening much like the one where Zachary had first proposed, Aurora and Zachary sat on their porch watching their children play in the yard. Sarah was chasing fireflies with a jar, her dark curls bouncing, while little Jacob tried to keep up on his chubby toddler legs. Young Thomas was out riding with his Uncle Thomas, teaching him the finer points of roping cattle. "Do you ever think about that day?" Zachary asked, his arm around Aurora's shoulders. "The day I met you. I think about it all the time," Aurora admitted. "About how the worst thing that ever happened to me led to the best thing. About how being sold like property somehow ended with me being freer and happier than I ever imagined possible." "I think about it too," Zachary said. "About how close I came to just riding past that wagon, minding my own business. About how different my life would be if I had not stopped." Aurora turned to look at him, at this man who had seen her in her worst moment and offered her dignity and choice and eventually love. His hair was starting to show threads of silver now, and there were lines around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun, but he was still the handsomest man she had ever seen. "I love you," she said. "More than I did yesterday, more than I will tomorrow, which does not make sense but is somehow true anyway." He kissed her soft and sweet, a kiss that tasted like coming home. "I love you too, Aurora Aldrich. You are the best thing that ever happened to me." They sat together as the sun set and the stars came out, and Aurora thought about the journey that had brought her here. About hunger and desperation, about being sold and saved, about choosing to forgive and learning to hope. About how sometimes the worst circumstances could lead to the greatest blessings if you were brave enough to keep going, to keep believing that something better was possible. The drought that had driven her mother to such desperate measures had finally broken years ago, and Fort Stanton was starting to recover, helped along by the wells and supplies that Aurora and Zachary had provided. The town would never be what it once was, but it would survive, and that was its own kind of miracle. Aurora had returned to the place that sold her, but she had come back with more than just food for the village. She had brought hope and opportunity, and the living proof that even the darkest circumstances could be survived and transcended. She had been traded for a few sacks of cornmeal, worth less than a good horse, but she had proven herself to be priceless. As the children's laughter rang through the evening air and Zachary's arms held her close, Aurora felt a deep sense of gratitude for all of it, even the painful parts, because they had shaped her into the woman she was now. Strong and brave and loved, with a family she had built through choice as much as blood, and a future that stretched out before her bright with possibility. The land that had once tried to kill her family with drought and starvation now bloomed green and fertile, fed by the wells they had helped dig and the rains that had finally returned. The ranch that had been her salvation had become her kingdom, not because she ruled it, but because she had helped build it into something that sustained not just her family but whole communities. Years later, in 1895, when Aurora was 36 and Zachary was 42, they took a trip back to Fort Stanton with all three of their children. The town had changed dramatically, grown and prospered in ways that would have seemed impossible during those dark drought years. There was a new church, a proper school, and businesses that actually thrived. The old house where Aurora had grown up had been torn down and replaced with a general store, and she stood looking at it with mixed feelings, remembering both the happy times before her father died and the desperate ones after. "Mama, was this really where you lived?" Sarah asked, holding her hand. "It was," Aurora said, "a long time ago when I was not much older than you are now." "Tell us the story again," young Thomas begged, "about how Papa saved you from the bad man." Aurora looked at Zachary, who grinned and shrugged. They had told their children an edited version of how they met, leaving out some of the more painful details, but keeping the essential truth that their father had seen someone in trouble and helped her. "Your father was the bravest, kindest man I had ever met," Aurora said, pulling Zachary close with her free hand. "He saw me when I was lost and scared, and he offered me a way forward. He gave me hope when I thought I had none left, and then he gave me a family and a home and a life beyond anything I had dreamed was possible." "That is because your mother is extraordinary," Zachary said, kissing the top of her head. "She took the second chance I offered her and built something amazing with it. She turned her suffering into compassion and used it to help countless other people. She is the real hero of this story." The children seemed satisfied with this and wandered off to explore the town with their Uncle Thomas keeping a watchful eye. Aurora and Zachary stood together in the dusty street, hands clasped, thinking about all the miles they had traveled together since that first meeting. "Do you have any regrets?" Aurora asked quietly. "Not a single one," Zachary said immediately. "Every choice I have made since the day I met you has led me to this moment, standing here with you and our children, healthy and happy and together. How could I regret any of that?" "Even the hard parts," Aurora pressed. "The droughts and the failed wells and the times when it seemed like we were not making any difference at all, especially the hard parts," Zachary said firmly. "Because those are what proved we were strong enough to handle anything as long as we faced it together." They visited Margaret's grave in the churchyard, where she had been laid to rest 2 years before after passing peacefully in her sleep at the age of 65. Aurora placed wildflowers on the headstone and said a quiet prayer, and found that when she thought of her mother now, the anger and hurt had faded to a distant ache, replaced by something softer and more forgiving. Her mother had made a terrible choice in a terrible situation, but she had spent the rest of her life trying to make amends, and Aurora could honor that effort even if she could never fully forget the betrayal. In the end, Margaret had died surrounded by family who loved her, knowing that her daughter had forgiven her and her grandchildren were thriving, and that was more than many people got. As they prepared to leave Fort Stanton and return home to the ranch, the mayor, a man named William Garrett, approached them. "Mr. and Mrs. Aldrich, I wanted to thank you again for everything you have done for our community. Without your help during the drought years, I do not know if Fort Stanton would have survived. You saved lives, and we will never forget that." "We only did what anyone should do when their neighbors are suffering," Aurora said. "But most people do not," Garrett replied. "Most people look out for themselves and let others fend as best they can. You two looked out for everyone, and that made all the difference." On the ride home, with the children dozing in the back of the wagon and the sun setting behind them, Aurora leaned against Zachary's shoulder and felt utterly content. She had been sold for food in this territory, treated like property, worth only what she could fetch in trade. But she had returned with so much more than food. She had returned with love and family and purpose, with the knowledge that she was valued and cherished, with the means and the will to help others avoid the fate she had barely escaped. She thought about the girl she had been, watching her mother count those coins with trembling hands, and wished she could tell that girl that everything would be all right. That the pain she was feeling would not last forever, that joy and love were waiting for her just around the corner, that she was stronger than she knew. But that girl was gone, transformed through fire and hardship into the woman Aurora was now. And while the transformation had been painful, Aurora would not trade it for anything, because it had brought her here to this moment, to this life. When they arrived home, the ranch hands came out to greet them, and Cal, who had been with them since the beginning, helped unload the wagon while Rodriguez entertained the children with stories. The house smelled like the bread Maria, the new cook they had hired last year, had been baking, and there were fresh flowers on the table. That night, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Aurora and Zachary sat in their bedroom, the window open to let in the cool night air. Zachary was reading a letter from a cattle buyer in Denver, and Aurora was mending a tear in young Thomas's shirt, and it was all so beautifully ordinary that she wanted to cry. "Zachary," she said, setting down her mending. He looked up immediately, always attuned to her moods. "What is it, love?" "I was just thinking about how grateful I am," she said. "For you, for our children, for this life we have built. I know I do not say it enough, but you saved me in every way a person can be saved. You gave me back my dignity and my freedom, and then you gave me your heart, and I will never stop being thankful for that." Zachary set down his letter and pulled her into his arms. "You saved me too," he said. "I did not know it at the time, but I was lonely before I met you, going through the motions of building this ranch without really knowing why. You gave me purpose, Aurora. You showed me what I was building for. You made this house a home and made my life worth living." They held each other for a long time, and Aurora listened to his heartbeat and felt the rise and fall of his breathing, and knew that this was what happiness felt like. Not the absence of pain or struggle, but the presence of love and purpose and belonging. The years continued to pass, each one bringing its own joys and challenges. There were more droughts, though never as severe as the one that had driven Margaret to sell her daughter. There were illnesses and injuries and the normal trials of raising children and running a ranch. But through it all, Aurora and Zachary faced everything together, their love deepening and strengthening with each passing season. In 1902, when Aurora was 43, she and Zachary started a charitable foundation dedicated to helping struggling families in New Mexico territory. They called it the Second Chance Foundation, and it provided not just emergency supplies but long-term assistance in the form of well digging, agricultural training, and small business loans. Aurora ran the foundation with the same fierce determination she brought to everything, driven by her own memories of desperation to make sure no other mother ever had to make the choice hers had made. The foundation became one of the most respected charitable organizations in the territory, and Aurora became known as a tireless advocate for the poor and vulnerable. She spoke at churches and town halls, sharing her own story when she thought it would help, using her experience as a bridge to connect with people who were suffering. Zachary supported her in all of this, not just financially but emotionally, taking on more of the ranch management so she could focus on the foundation. He was so proud of her he could hardly stand it, loved telling anyone who would listen about his brilliant, compassionate wife who was changing lives every single day. Their children grew into remarkable adults. Young Thomas took over more and more of the ranch operations, showing the same natural talent for ranching his father had. Sarah became a teacher, opening a school for poor children in Santa Fe, carrying on her mother's legacy of helping those in need. And Jacob, the baby, became a lawyer, using his skills to fight for water rights and land protection for small farmers. In 1910, when Aurora was 51 and Zachary 57, New Mexico was admitted to the Union as the 47th state. They celebrated with their entire extended family. 3 generations gathered at the ranch that had been the foundation of all their good fortune. Aurora looked around at the crowd, at her children and grandchildren, at the ranch hands who had become family, at the thriving land that had once tried to kill her with drought. She thought about the long journey from that desperate day in Fort Stanton to this moment of triumph and togetherness. "What are you thinking about?" Zachary asked, sliding his arm around her waist. "About how far we have come," Aurora said. "About how that scared girl who was sold for food became this woman with a family and a foundation and a life that matters." "You always mattered," Zachary said fiercely. "Even when you were at your lowest, even when you thought you were worthless, you mattered. You just needed someone to show you that." "And you did," Aurora said, turning to kiss him. "You showed me every single day for 32 years, and I hope you know how much that means to me." "I know," he said softly, "because you have shown me too. We saved each other, Aurora. That is what love does." As the celebration continued around them, Aurora felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. Her life had not been easy, and there were scars she still carried from those dark days of being sold and seeing her mother broken by desperation. But those scars were proof that she had survived, that she had endured and overcome and built something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy. She had returned to Fort Stanton all those years ago with enough supplies to feed the whole village, but more than that, she had returned with hope. With the living proof that circumstances did not have to define you, that the worst beginning could lead to the best ending if you had courage and love and people who believed in you. And now, looking at all she had built with Zachary, all the lives they had touched through their foundation, all the love they had created and nurtured in their family, Aurora knew that her life had mattered. She had taken the second chance Zachary offered her and multiplied it 1,000-fold, creating second chances for countless others. That was her legacy, not the story of the girl who was sold, but the story of the woman who rose from that betrayal to become a beacon of hope and help for everyone who crossed her path. The story of a love that started with an act of kindness and grew into something that changed not just 2 lives but an entire territory. As the sun set on the celebration, painting the New Mexico sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, Aurora leaned into Zachary's embrace and smiled. She had been sold for food, traded like property, valued at a few sacks of meal and some salt pork. But she had returned worth more than gold, rich in love and purpose, and the knowledge that she had made a real difference in the world. And she had done it all with this man beside her, the man who had seen her worth when no one else did, who had loved her when she felt unlovable, who had given her the space and support to become the woman she was always meant to be. In 1918, as World War I was ending and the world was changing in ways they could never have imagined back in 1878, Aurora and Zachary celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary. They were older now, Zachary's hair completely white and Aurora's liberally streaked with silver, but their love was as strong as ever, tempered by decades of partnership and shared purpose. They held a small gathering at the ranch, just family and their oldest friends, and when Zachary gave a toast, his voice shook with emotion. 40 years ago, I married the most extraordinary woman I have ever known, he said, raising his glass. I thought I was saving her, but the truth is, she saved me. She took my lonely house and made it a home. She took my solitary life and filled it with love and purpose. Everything good in my life stems from the day I met Aurora Catherine, and I thank God every single day that I was in the right place at the right time to offer her a way forward. Aurora wiped tears from her eyes as everyone cheered and drank, then stood to give her own toast. Zachary Aldrich saw me on the worst day of my life and chose kindness, she said. He could have ridden past, could have ignored my suffering, but instead he stopped. He helped. He offered me not just employment but dignity, not just safety but freedom, and then, miracle of miracles, he loved me. He chose me every single day for 40 years, and I have chosen him right back, and that choosing is the best thing I have ever done. To my husband, my partner, my love. They drank and kissed, and their children and grandchildren applauded, and the celebration continued late into the night. But eventually, everyone went home or to bed, and it was just Aurora and Zachary alone on the porch, watching the stars. Do you think we have done enough? Aurora asked quietly, the question that had haunted her for years. Enough for what? Zachary asked. To make a difference. To justify all the blessings we have received, to honor all the people who did not survive what I survived. Zachary was quiet for a moment, thinking. I do not know if anyone ever does enough, he said finally, but I know we have done what we could with the resources and time we had. We have helped hundreds of families, maybe thousands if you count everyone the foundation has touched. We have raised children who care about justice and helping others. We have built a life based on love and generosity instead of greed and selfishness. Is it enough to fix all the suffering in the world? No, but it is enough to matter, enough to make a real difference, and I think that is all anyone can ask. Aurora nodded, accepting the wisdom in his words. She had spent so many years trying to save everyone, driven by the memory of her own near destruction, that she sometimes forgot to recognize all that she had accomplished. You are right, she said. We have done good work, you and I. The best work, Zachary agreed. The work of building a life worth living and helping others do the same. They sat in comfortable silence, hands clasped, hearts beating in tandem after 40 years of loving each other. Around them, the ranch hummed with life, the cattle lowing in the distance, the horses shuffling in their stalls, the land itself seeming to breathe contentment. This was what Aurora had built from the ashes of being sold for food. Not just a ranch or a fortune or a foundation, but a legacy of love and help and second chances. She had returned to Fort Stanton all those years ago with supplies to feed a hungry village, but she had brought so much more. She had brought hope and proof that the worst circumstances were not the end of the story, that love and kindness could transform even the darkest situations into something beautiful. In 1925, at the age of 66, Aurora fell ill with pneumonia. For a terrifying week, Zachary sat by her bedside, holding her hand and willing her to fight, praying that he would not lose her after 47 years of marriage. Their children came and sat vigil, and the whole community held its breath, hoping their beloved benefactor would recover. Aurora did recover, though it took months for her to regain her strength. During that time, as she slowly healed, she had a lot of time to think about her life, about all she had experienced and accomplished. She thought about that girl in the wagon, about Zachary stopping on a dusty road, about Thomas growing up strong and healthy, about Margaret's tearful attempts at redemption. She thought about all the families the foundation had helped, about the wells they had dug and the schools they had funded and the lives they had changed. She thought about her children and grandchildren, about the love that filled every corner of her life. And she realized that she was, despite everything, deeply happy. Not in a simple or uncomplicated way, but in the profound way of someone who had suffered and survived and built something meaningful from the ruins. When she was finally strong enough to walk again, Zachary took her outside to the porch, and they sat together watching the sunset just as they had done thousands of times before. "I thought I was going to lose you," Zachary said, his voice rough with remembered fear. "Not yet," Aurora said, squeezing his hand. "We still have time." And they did. They had 5 more good years together, years filled with grandchildren and great-grandchildren, with work that mattered and love that sustained them. They celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary in 1928, surrounded by over 100 family members and friends, a testament to all the lives they had touched. Zachary passed away in his sleep in January of 1930, at the age of 76. He went peacefully with Aurora beside him, and his last words were, "I love you, my darling girl," which made Aurora smile even through her tears because she was 70 years old, and he still called her his girl. The grief was crushing. The loss of her partner and best friend after 52 years of marriage, leaving a hole in Aurora's heart that could never be filled. But she also felt grateful, so grateful for every moment they had shared, for the life they had built together, for the love that had sustained her through so much. Aurora lived for another 8 years after Zachary's death, staying active in the foundation and spending time with her large and loving family. She died in 1938, at the age of 79, with her children and grandchildren around her bed. Her last thoughts were of Zachary. Of that day he stopped his horse on a dusty road and offered her a way forward. Of all the love and joy and purpose that simple act of kindness had created. She thought about being sold for food and returning to feed a village, about how the worst betrayal of her life had somehow led to the greatest blessings. And as she closed her eyes for the last time, Aurora Catherine Aldrich smiled, because she knew that her life had mattered, that she had made a real difference, and that the love she and Zachary had shared would echo through generations of the family they had created together. The Second Chance Foundation continued for decades after her death, eventually becoming one of the largest charitable organizations in New Mexico, helping thousands of families survive hard times and build better lives. And in Fort Stanton, where it had all begun, there was a plaque in the town square commemorating Aurora Catherine Aldrich, the woman who had been sold for food in 1878 and returned with enough supplies to save a village, who had gone on to spend her life ensuring no one else would ever have to make such desperate choices. But more than the foundation, or the plaque, or any of the material legacy she left behind, Aurora's real legacy lived in the hearts of all the people who had known her love, in her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, who carried forward her values of compassion and generosity, in the countless families who had received help from the foundation at their darkest moments, In the story that was passed down through generations about how one act of kindness on a dusty road had changed not just 2 lives but an entire region. Aurora had been sold for less than the price of a good horse, valued only for what she could bring in trade. But she had proven herself to be priceless, worth more than all the gold in the West, because she had lived a life of love and purpose and meaning. She had taken the second chance Zachary offered her and used it to create second chances for everyone she could reach. And in the end, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.